Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 629, and today is July 5th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Just want to remind people where they could find and share the show from. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. And of course, I publish all the work I write and other articles that I think are important on my Twitter account at KyleAnzalone_. Great place to find every episode of the show as well. Now, before we get into the news today, one more thing to mention, and that is we are kicking off our summer fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. Guys, we only do 2 of these fundraisers a year, and so when we hold them, it's really helpful when people go out and support. We get, we make our donation number on small dollar donations. I think just 20, 30, 40 bucks or so is all the average donation to the Libertarian Institute is. So if you can head on over, contribute what you can, make a donation, that allows me to do what I do here and so many other people at the Institute. We have a lot of really great stuff going on at the Institute. It's not just my show, not just the news I write. There are new op-ed articles every day at the show. There are multiple podcasts: the Scott Horton Show, Keith Knight's Don't Tread on Anyone, Patrick McFarland with Vital Dissent, Tommy Solomon's with Year Zero, and of course, there's a lot of really great books published at the Libertarian Institute. This is something that we are really proud of. This past year, we published books from James Bovard, Lori Calhoun, and Thomas Woods. I mean, we just got so much really great stuff going on with the Institute. And then, of course, we got new books coming out all the time, new content on the website every single day. And we really don't ask for very much money. We don't ask for money very often. So now that it is one of our fundraiser times, head on over to the Libertarian Institute and make a donation today. If you just go to the website, like I'm sure many of you do every morning, you could find right on the top of the website a donation button or libertarianinstitute.org/donate. Now let's get into the news today. First up here, this article I wrote for the Institute: U.S. and Venezuela agree to improve ties. So a top Venezuelan negotiator reported that Caracas and Washington agreed to work on improving the relations between the two nations. The U.S. has waged an economic war and supported multiple coup attempts against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. In a post on X, President Maduro's top negotiator, Jorge Rodriguez, said that the two sides agreed to a willingness to improve relations during an initial meeting. The negotiator wrote that the U.S. and Venezuelan teams agreed to continue talks. The U.S. has maintained sanctions on Venezuela for over a decade. Under President Donald Trump, the economic war escalated to a maximum pressure attempt to destroy the Venezuelan economy and lead to the overthrow of Maduro. Additionally, during the Trump presidency, the U.S. backed Juan Guaido, who made several unsuccessful overt coup attempts. The Biden White House has largely continued Trump's policy. At times, Biden has engaged with Caracas in talks, but conditioned all sanctions relief in Venezuela to comply with U.S. dictates in Venezuelan presidential elections. Previous negotiations between the two sides broke down when Venezuela disallowed the U.S. preferred candidate to run for president in their most recent elections. The economic war on Venezuela has pushed Caracas into developing ties with other nations sanctioned by the U.S., including Iran. The sanctions have also impoverished the Venezuelan people, contributing to tens of thousands of deaths. So hopefully the White House is looking at seriously improving ties here, but given the late date in the Biden administration, I kind of really doubt that any serious deal is going to get done here, but maybe some good news. Next up, this one from Dave DeCamp, July 4th, antiwar.com. NATO members agreed to give Ukraine $43 billion in military aid for 2025. NATO allies have agreed to pledge $43 billion in military aid for Ukraine, which will be provided next year, Reuters reported on Wednesday. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg was looking for the alliance to make a multi-year commitment to ensure long-term support for the proxy war, but the allies did not agree. Instead, they will reevaluate military aid for Ukraine each year. The agreement says that NATO will aim to meet this pledges through proportionate contributions. If the $43 billion is funded based on how much each member contributes to NATO, most of the burden would be on the U.S. since it pays for 2/3 of the alliance's budget. The $43 billion is a part of a slew of measures NATO will announce as its summit next week in Washington. NATO is also expected to station civilian officials in Kiev and establish a new command in Germany that will oversee military aid and training for Ukraine, taking over duties currently overseen by the U.S. While planning to provide tens of billions in new military aid, NATO will also tell Ukraine that it's too corrupt to join the alliance. The Telegraph reported this week that the alliance released a communique calling on Ukraine to take more anti-corruption steps before talks on NATO membership could progress. President Biden has frequently cited Ukraine's corruption as a reason why the country couldn't join NATO, but that hasn't stopped him from providing over $100 billion in aid to Ukraine, which includes tens of billions in the form of direct budgetary aid and that funds the government. So that, those are direct cash infusions. They don't even have to bother to resell the weapons. And there is a very good article on the front page of antiwar.com today by Ted Snyder explaining that Zelensky is very unhappy that he is not going to get that invitation to join the alliance, or at least a timeline on that invitation at this upcoming summit. All right, next up here, Ukraine's Zelensky rejects idea of ceasefire with Russia. This one from Dave DeCamp, again, July 4th, antiwar.com. Ukrainian President Zelensky rejected the idea of a ceasefire with Russia in an interview with Bloomberg on Wednesday. The Ukrainian leader said he couldn't accept a ceasefire that leaves Russian forces in areas of Ukraine they have captured, and said that Russian President Vladimir Putin could not be trusted. We simply cannot trust Putin in principle, Zelensky said. We cannot trust him because he is a killer and an aggressor. Zelensky's comments came after Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban made his first wartime visit to Kiev and suggested Zelensky considered a ceasefire with Russia rather than his so-called peace formula that requires Russia to withdraw before peace talks can even begin. After meeting with Zelensky, Orban said that the Ukrainian leader was not enthusiastic about his idea. Ukrainian officials have also said that Zelensky quickly rejected the proposal. On Thursday, Russian President Vladimir Putin said he couldn't agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine because he couldn't be sure that it would be followed. Both Putin and Zelensky said the other side could use ceasefires to rebuild their forces. Putin said, "We can't allow the enemy to use this ceasefire to improve its situation, to arm itself, to reconstruct its army through forced mobilization, and be ready to continue the armed conflict." In his interview, Zelensky said that he wanted to see the former President Trump's plan to end the war in Ukraine. Trump has claimed he could quickly end the war, but hasn't articulated how he would do it. Putin also discussed Trump's comments and said he thought the former president was serious about ending the proxy war. Putin said the fact that Mr. Trump, as presidential candidate, declares that he is ready and wants to stop the war in Ukraine, we take this completely seriously. I am not, of course, familiar with the possible proposals for how he plans to do this. This is the key question, but I have no doubt that he means it sincerely, and we support it. Throughout the war, the only time a real peace deal was on the table was back in March and April of 2022, but the U.S. and NATO discouraged Ukraine from signing the agreement and promised to support its fight against Russia. All right, next up here, this one about the situation with China. Chinese Coast Guard detains Taiwanese fishing boat near Kinmen Islands. So the Kinmen Islands are islands just 2.5 miles from the coast of mainland China. So the Chinese Coast Guard detained a Taiwanese fishing boat and its crew off the coast of Kinmen Taiwanese controlled islands that are located just a few miles off the coast of mainland China. China has increased its patrols around Kinmen, known as Quemoy, on the mainland since February, when an incident involving Taiwan's Coast Guard ended with 2 Chinese fishermen drowning. Around the same time, it was revealed that U.S. Army Special Forces soldiers had been deployed to Kinmen, a highly provocative step. In March, Taiwan confirmed the presence of U.S. troops on Kinmen. Some parts of the Kinmen Islands are just 2.5 miles from a Chinese mainland city. Since China has stepped up its patrols around Kinmen, there have been several tense standoffs between the Taiwanese and Chinese Coast Guards. According to the South China Morning Post, the Taiwanese Coast Guard's administration said that the Taiwanese fishing boat Da Jin Man 88 was stopped by 2 Chinese Coast Guard vessels late Thursday while operating 23.7 nautical miles from Kinmen. The Chinese vessels made the fishing boat navigate towards the mainland city of Xinjiang in Fujian province. Taiwan's Coast Guard administration said it tried to block the vessels but gave up after a 50-minute standoff to avoid escalation. Taiwan acknowledgement that the fishing vessel was operating in mainland-controlled waters. And so I guess, at this point, it seems like this is probably the end of this confrontation, but more are likely to continue, it seems, especially as the U.S. is adding some fuel to the fire. All right, next up here, moving on to news about Israel. UN says Israel's evacuation order wiped out efforts to distribute aid. So Israel's evacuation order for Eastern Khan Yunis has wiped out the UN's effort to improve aid deliveries via the Karim Shalom border crossing in southern Gaza. The UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, said on Wednesday. So this is a statement from the head of OCHA for Palestinian territories. We have been engineering a lot of solutions and trying and testing, improving and failing at times. And now with this evacuation order, this has all been again wiped out. Israel's evacuation order impacted 250,000 Palestinians living in Khan Yunis, and many had recently fled Israel's assault on Rafah. One Palestinian family that fled Khan Yunis to an Israeli-declared safe zone was hit by an Israeli strike on Tuesday that killed 12 people, including 5 children and 3 women. On Wednesday, Israel strikes continued to hit targets across the Gaza Strip. According to Al Jazeera, Gaza's health ministry said at least 28 Palestinians were killed in the previous 24-hour period. One strike on Wednesday slammed into a residential building next to the Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, which is in the western part of the city that Israel is claiming as a safe zone. A day earlier, patients and medical staff from the European hospital in eastern Khan Yunis fled to the Nasser Hospital. So the OCHA official noted that the bombings of the so-called safe zones in Gaza was the only place the world where people cannot find safe refuge and cannot leave the front line. So just a horrific situation. Doesn't seem like it's going to get better anytime soon. Israel says it will send delegations for renewed hostage deal negotiations. So the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu told Biden on Thursday that he would send a delegation for renewed indirect hostage deal negotiations with Hamas. The conversations came the day after Hamas said it gave new ideas to the Qatari mediators that the U.S. and Israeli officials described in comments to the media as a breakthrough. But there are signs that Netanyahu and members of his coalition government are working to sabotage the chances of an agreement. In his conversation with President Biden, Netanyahu reiterated his position that the genocidal war in Gaza won't end until all Israeli objectives are completed, including the eradication of Hamas, a goal the Israeli military says is not possible. Hamas has been adamant that any hostage deal must include a permanent ceasefire. The Times of Israel reported that in a meeting with his negotiators before deciding to send a delegation. Netanyahu stressed again that the war will only end after achieving all its goals and not a moment earlier. An Israeli outlet noted that Netanyahu was teaming up with some of the extremist elements of his government to sabotage a ceasefire. The report said that the Prime Minister's office planted a story in the media claiming to be a security source that Hamas's response offered nothing new. Israeli security and intelligence officials were angered by the fake story, and according to Haaretz, genuine Israeli security sources said Hamas's proposal gave Israel something to work with. Israel's top brass appears to be ready for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza since the military has been struggling against Hamas. The Palestinian group has been able to reestablish itself in areas that have been decimated by the Israeli military. One reason they want a ceasefire in Gaza is to prepare for a potential full-blown war with Lebanon. But extremist ministers, including National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, have been opposed to any deal with Hamas and have the power to dissolve the coalition government, giving them significant sway with Netanyahu, who I don't think wants to really end the fighting either. All right, next up here, Israeli minister retweets post calling for occupation of Egypt Sinai Peninsula. So this is Egypt's heritage minister, and they retweeted a post on X promoting a t-shirt that calls for the Israeli conquest of Egypt Sinai Peninsula, which Israel occupied from 67 to 82. The t-shirt shows a picture of what is supposed to be a map of Israel that covers the Sinai, West Bank, and Gaza with a logo that says Occupation Now. The post links to a website that sells other merchandise that also supports the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon and Jordan. The occupation began with an idea. The website reads in Hebrew, according to Google Translate: wear a shirt, drink a cup of coffee, and participate in the occupation of the land. The heritage minister also made headlines back in November when he suggested in a radio interview that dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza was one of the possibilities for Israel. He also said there was no such thing as uninvolved civilians in Gaza. So, just a sick member, and what a surprise, he's a part of Itamar Ben-Gvir's Jewish Power Party. Now we got another senior Israeli lawmaker saying that they want to nuke Iran. This one from Brett Wilkins. We reprinted it at antiwar.com. So a longtime Israeli lawmaker and former defense minister took to the airwaves and social media on Wednesday to suggest his country should do whatever it takes to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. So this is Avigdor Lieberman of the right-wing Israel Betsu party, and he said this during a Channel 12 interview. It's not possible anymore to stop the Iranian nuclear program with conventional means, and we will have to use all means that are available to us. We will have to stop the deliberate policy of ambiguity, and it needs to be clear what is at stake here. Lieberman continued, apparently referring to Israel's refusal to say whether it has nuclear weapons. What is at stake here is the future of our nation, the future of the state of Israel, and we will not take any risks. When pressed on what he meant by stopping Iran with non-conventional means, Lieberman said, "I said it very clearly. Right now, there is no time to stop the Iranian nuclear program, their weaponization by using conventional means." Lieberman made similar comments on social media, where his remarks sparked alarm and condemnation. The lawmaker's hardline calls come amid powdercake tensions between Tel Aviv and Tehran, which warned last week that an Israeli invasion of Lebanon, from which Iranian ally Hezbollah is resisting Israeli annihilation in Gaza, would trigger an obliterating war. According to the Arms Control Association, a U.S.-based advocacy group, Iran is a threshold state, meaning it has developed the necessary capabilities to build nuclear arms. However, a February 2024 threat assessment report authored by the U.S. Director of National Intelligence stated Iran is not currently undertaking the key nuclear weapons development activities necessary to produce a testable nuclear device. since 2020. However, Tehran has stated that it can no longer be constrained by any JCPOA limits, the report says in a reference to the so-called Iran nuclear deal, which the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from in 2018 under former President Donald Trump. The report continues, Iran has greatly expanded its nuclear program, reduced IAEA monitoring, and undertaking activities that better position it to produce a nuclear device if it chooses to do so. Iran maintains a nuclear program for peaceful purposes, although Kamel Karzai, a foreign policy advisor to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, told the Financial Times earlier this week that the country would have to change its doctrine if it faced an existential threat. The ACA and others estimate that Israel has around 90 nuclear warheads and fissile material for approximately 200 more. Lieberman isn't the first Israeli lawmaker to suggest nuclear war against Iran. Far-right Deputy Knesset Speaker, who sparked outrage by saying Israeli forces are too humane in Gaza and should burn Palestinian territory, said in April, in the event of a conflict with Iran, if we do not receive American ammunition, we will have to use everything we have, referring to the nuclear weapons. Next up here, this one from our friend Connor Freeman at the Libertarian Institute, July 3rd. Israel approves largest West Bank settlement expansion in over 3 decades. So Connor writes here, as violence and ethnic cleansing surges throughout the occupied West Bank, the Israeli NGO Peace Now says Tel Aviv has approved the largest illegal settlement expansion in over 3 decades. Israel's Supreme Planning Council will also review plans to advance the construction of more than 6,000 housing units across the dozens of West Bank Jewish-only colonies. So this came as far-right finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, who holds a key position in the defense ministry acting as the West Bank's de facto governor, is moving forward with plans to fully annex the occupied territory. According to a copy of the order acquired by the Associated Press, Israeli authorities have greenlit the seizure of about 5 square miles of land in the Jordan Valley. This is the largest. This latest land grabs follow seizures of roughly 4 square miles in the West Bank in February and March this year. Peace Now explains that this latest seizure is the largest single appropriation approved since the 1993 Oslo Accords, adding that 2024 has been far a peak year for organized Israeli theft of Palestinian land intended for the two-state solution. This Jordan Valley settlement expansion connects illegal colonies along the critical corridor bordering Jordan. Monitors say this reflects an effort to preclude the establishment of a continuous Palestinian state. A United Nations spokesperson deemed the latest move as a step in the wrong direction, emphasizing the direction we want to be heading in is to find a negotiated two-state solution. So Peace Now's head of settlement tracking says the buffer zone between Palestinian lands and Jordan is meant to choke off the potential for a Palestinian state and force Palestinians into isolated islands surrounded by Israeli land. The spokesperson continued, they definitely see this area as a strategic area, as one of the first and one of the easiest ways to begin annexation. By claiming these large swaths of territory as state lands, Israelis have the opportunity to seek leases while Palestinian private ownership is banned. Israel maintains in excess of 100 exclusivist colonies throughout the West Bank, which have been built into small towns or suburbs. Additionally, Haaretz reports the agenda published Wednesday includes plans to discuss in the coming days the construction of 6,000 new housing units in the West Bank settlements. Smotrich posted last week that the security cabinet's rubber-stamped measures suggest the construction of thousands of settler homes and the legalization of 5 illegal outposts to fight against the recognition of a Palestinian state. Smoltrich is explicitly punishing the Palestinian people in retaliation for the decision made by several European governments, including Ireland, Norway, Spain, and Slovenia, to recognize a Palestinian state. He also said the measures were motivated by the announcements that the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor is seeking arrest warrants to put Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on trial for war crimes committed in the Gaza Strip. As CNN reported last month, Smoltrich said in May that Israel should approve 10,000 settlements in the West Bank, establish a new settlement for every country that recognizes the state of Palestine, and cancel travel for permits for Palestinian Authority officials. Since Israel's war on Gaza began, the UN has documented over 1,000 violent settler attacks in the West Bank against Palestinians, including killing and property destruction. More than 550 Palestinians have been murdered by the Israeli army and settlers in the West Bank during that time as well. UNICEF declared last year it to be the deadliest year on record for Palestinian children in the occupied territory. Since last October, almost 140 children have been killed. Rights groups say the violence and proliferation of illegal outposts during the war in Gaza has led to the displacement of numerous Palestinian villages and communities, but in the same period, thousands of people have been displaced in the West Bank by the same Israeli state itself. As the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has detailed, Israeli authorities demolished, confiscated, or forced the demolition of 1,061 Palestinian structures across the West Bank, of which 38% were inhabited homes. As a result, 2,368 people, including 1,047 children, were displaced. Over half of those displaced, 1,208, were during military operations, particularly in Jenin and Tulkarm cities and the surrounding refugee camps. 42%, or about 1,000 people, were due to the lack of permits, and 7% were displaced by punitive demolitions. And so if a relative of yours is accused of doing something by Israel that the Israeli government doesn't like, they will just destroy your house as punishment. So Smoltrich, who is himself an illegal settler, recently unveiled his plans for the West Bank's full annexation at a speech to the far-right religious Zionism party that he leads, a recording which was obtained by Peace Now. The minister proclaimed, "We came to settle the land, to build it, and to prevent its division and the establishment of a Palestinian state, God forbid." Smoltrich vowed to change the map dramatically and declare more Palestinian territory as Israeli state lands than ever before. He further pledged to expand farming outposts, which illegal settlers exploit to ethnically cleanse rural areas. Smoltrich has transferred control over large parts of the West Bank civil administration, henceforth overseen by the Israeli military, to ideologically sympathetic settlement administration bureaucrats. As the AP notes, Wednesday's declaration was signed under Hilaire Roth's authority. Peace Now said Roth was appointed as a deputy to Smoltrich earlier this year to ramp up settlement expansion and state lands. Roth is a former resident of Yitzhar, an infamously violent and radical settlement. During Smoltrich's speech, he assured his allies, Netanyahu is with us full on. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the besieged Gaza Strip, have been militarily conquered by Tel Aviv since 1967. The millions of Palestinian Christians and Muslims living in the West Bank suffer daily under brutal Israeli apartheid rule. The former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert recently condemned Netanyahu as an existentialist threat to the state of Israel for, among other things, accusing him of eschewing diplomatic off-ramps, destroying Israel's economy, and emboldening settler thugs in an attempt to start a war in the West Bank. Peace Now echoed these settlements, saying it it seems that from every direction, from the cabinet resolutions to the work of the planning council, destruction of the diplomatic solution is the main endeavor of the current government. Since the start of the war, the Israeli government has been building, developing, and investing every effort in the construction across the West Bank, compared with the opposite attitude of investing inside the wounded and bleeding Israel since October 7th. So Israeli military operations in the West Bank have severely intensified, with the UN documenting 28 airstrikes on the occupied territory, slaughtering almost 80 Palestinians, including 14 children. The United Nations latest assessment found 200 homes sustained damage during recent operations by Israeli forces in the Nur Sham refugee camp in Tulkram. A Palestinian woman and child were also killed. All right, couple stories on Lebanon here. Israeli strike kills senior Hezbollah commander in southern Lebanon. So Israel carried out an airstrike in the southern Lebanese city of Tyre on Wednesday, killing Mohammed Naith Nassar, described as the head of the Aziz unit. He would be the highest ranking Hezbollah member killed in an attack in nearly a month. After Nassar's death, a video was released from 1999 when southern Lebanon was facing an Israeli occupation. The footage showed Nassar taking part in operations against one of the Israeli military outposts. The Aziz unit is responsible for operations in one of the segments of the southern Lebanon border area. There are 3 such units, all of which have been engaged in the tit-for-tat attacks against neighboring Israel. Hezbollah responded to the death by firing an estimated 100 Kajushka rockets against the headquarters of the Israeli Air Defense and Missile Unit in the occupied Golan Heights. They also fired heavier rockets at the Karat Shalom barracks. The attacks come amid growing concern that the escalating attacks by both sides is leading to a full-scale war along the border. The international community has been pushing for a diplomatic solution that would move Hezbollah away from the border in return for an end to Israeli airstrikes on the country. Reports are that Israel has set the second half of July for the timing of a new offensive in Lebanon. Hezbollah conditioned an end to their strikes on a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, and the Hezbollah rocketing of Israel did kill 1 IDF reservist. So that was another update from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. And we're going to wrap up here with this one from Dave DeCamp. June saw the most Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping of the year. And so, they're 6 months now or so into the war against the Houthis, and the Houthis are only escalating their attacks. So there were more Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping in June than any other month of the year, Middle East Eye reported on Wednesday, citing data from the UK Maritime Trade Operations, that's UK MTO. According to the UK MTO, there were 16 confirmed Houthi attacks on shipping in June. Only December of 2023 saw more attacks since the campaign started in response to Israel's onslaught in Gaza. The numbers demonstrate that the bombing campaign against the Houthis in Yemen that was launched by the US and UK has done nothing to deter the Houthis, who are officially known as Ansar Allah. The U.S. military continues to intercept Houthi missiles and drones over the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden and launch strikes in Yemen, which has cost the U.S. over nearly $1 billion. According to the commander of the United Navy destroyer USS Canary, which recently returned home from Red Sea deployment, the campaign has been the largest U.S. naval battle since World War II. The Houthis have been clear that the only way they will stop their attacks on Israel and on Israeli-linked shipping and other commercial shipping is that there is a ceasefire in Gaza and an end to the Israeli siege. Tim Linderkane, the U.S. envoy to Yemen, has acknowledged that the Houthis would likely be true to their word, but the U.S. continues to support Israel's genocidal war in Gaza instead of pushing for a unilateral ceasefire, which would not only bring an end to the fighting in Gaza, but also in Lebanon and Yemen. But instead, we just keep plowing forward with all these wars and support for Israel. All right, everybody, if you're still listening, please head on over to the Libertarian Institute and make a donation. If you can't, subscribe to the show, share the show, and we'll be back with more episodes next week.